So thank you all for joining us. This is the first session in our Winter Getting into the Weeds series. So this is the first of 4 webinars, and I'll mention the next one at the end. But thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Mason McDonald, and we're going to be talking about crop response to environmental stress. All right, perfect. So as I mentioned, our guest today is Dr. Mason McDonald, who is a member of the Faculty of Agriculture, or the Dalhousie's Faculty of Agriculture in Truro. He received his MSc in Agriculture from Dal and a PhD in Plant Biology from Laval. His main area of focus is ecophysiology. His research focuses on plant physiology, abiotic and environmental stress in plants, stress mitigating technologies, vertical farming, phytoremediation, agroforestry, and plant diversity. So a little bit of everything there. He worked at the Christmas Tree Research Center and has worked with a variety of crops focusing on stress response in plants. So Dr. McDonald also teaches at Dalhousie, including courses on environmental studies, environmental sampling and analysis, and plant ecophysiology. So with that, I will, Sherry. Here we go. I will hand it over to you and take it away.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm gonna try to share my screen, and then I'll double check and make sure I've done that. So before I jump in, is my slideshow showing up okay?
Yes, yeah, full screen, all good to go.
All right, well, thanks so much. So thank you for that kind introduction. And Caitlin, I really must say thank you so much for finding a picture of me back when I had hair. So that was wonderful for me. It's awesome to have so many people here. I scrolled through the participant list really quick, and actually I was surprised. I know quite a few of the people, or at least some of the names are familiar. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about crop response and adaptation to environmental stress. So it's been a rough little bit, right? Like, I mean, I could go back a few years. I only went back as far as 2022. I didn't have to go back very far to find examples of some tough times. So here's a picture left over from Fiona, which was our most damaging hurricane in Atlantic Canadian history. In 2023, we continue to set records with record-breaking wildfires, 25,000 hectares burned. The summer continued because right after we decided to catch on fire, we were given a lot of rain, and a lot of rain. So up there, 900 millimeters of rainfall from June to August in some areas of Nova Scotia. And just because it's nice and recent, here's our latest Snowmageddon. I haven't figured out what catchy little title they're giving it. I've been waiting for, the white wand type thing. But this is the one I see on most of the media outlets. So I haven't seen all the official numbers, but I think most of us probably have tuned in and seen Cape Breton with their state of emergency. Up to 1.5 meters in some areas have fallen. So, like I said, it's been a tough few years. And although each of these things doesn't always directly tie to every type of producer or every type of agricultural industry, there's definitely some ties here and things that we need to talk about. So what I'm going to talk about today, I know it's supposed to be environmental stress in crops and that sort of thing, and it's going to be, but I want to talk a little bit about why we're seeing some of the things that we're seeing. So here are my outline. You can see we're going to talk just a little bit about climate change. I want to talk about some of the major things that are happening and what's actually happening to the crops, or what we can expect to happen. And I'm going to talk about it more from a physiological standpoint. I'll try to relate that to sort of yields, because that's what I normally do when I'm talking about this. But we want to see what's happening to the plant. We already kind of know that the yields are being impacted by this. We will look at climate change as a whole and the yield. And then I've got 3 just localized case studies that I wanted to share with you if I have time at the end. So let's talk about climate change real quick. Climate change is contentious, right? Like we can sit here, I can sit here and talk to you about climate change. Climate change is this, it's that, it's this person's fault, whatever. But it's contentious. Not everyone agrees. Not everyone thinks it's a real thing. The term itself refers to long range change in our weather patterns. So that's what it's saying. We can usually point to things like snowstorms, floods, fires as a little bit of evidence towards it. And I'll talk about that. One of the big debates is why it's happening. And I'm not even getting into that debate today. Generally, from the scientific community, you're going to say human activities are causing it. But that's a whole nother lecture if we wanted to talk about something like that. No, I want to talk about the things that we're actually seeing. So I'm not worried right now about why climate change is happening. I'm not even worried about how you would go about fixing it, all much bigger pictures, but what are the things that are happening here at the ground level? There are three things that we cannot deny. We cannot deny that carbon dioxide has increased in the atmosphere. We cannot deny that the temperature has been changing. And we cannot deny how frequent some of these extreme events have been happening. When I talk about climate change, one of the big things about this is you can wrap the whole thing up in this umbrella of environmental stress. So what I work with when I'm talking about ecophysiology is environmental stress, which is anything that's happening in our environment that's causing a stress for plants. And in particular, I'm looking at crops, plants that we're trying to generate value in food and other resources from. If we look at the carbon dioxide side, and this is some of these things I talk about in classes and stuff all the time. And one of the things I always say when I talk about this is we have to come to some consensus about actually what's happening. And that's why we look at things like increased CO2. It's really difficult to dispute that because here's actual measurements of CO2 measured since 1960 when we had a concentration that was in and around 310 parts per million up until 2023 on this particular chart, where we're up above 420 parts per million. So it's hard to deny that we haven't seen 100 plus part per million increase in CO2. All right, so that's a problem, but what is that causing? This is one of my favorite graphs when we start talking about this with respect to environmental stress. There are two things that the increases in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are causing. One is the old name of it, global warming. We don't hear that as much anymore, but global warming suggested that the temperature would increase. I don't want to get too much into, like, I used to teach statistics, so I see this bell-shaped curve and I'm like, oh, yay, but I'm not going to get too much into it. This is showing the distribution of temperatures. And if there's an increase in temperature, the whole thing slides over to the right, which just suggests it's warmer. We're going to see less cold weather. We're going to see more hot weather. That's not really what's happening, but that's what this shift would cause. The other one is we're seeing an increase in variability. This is where we had to get rid of the global warming concept because we realized it was more than that. And if you look here, the original graph is the skinny one, and the new graph is sort of the wider one. And the wider one is showing you that under more variability, you'd actually have the exact same average temperature, but you'd see more record-breaking cold weather and more record-breaking hot weather. This sounds a little bit like what we're seeing. I didn't even put like heat waves and stuff that we had in the summer. Like last summer, we set a new record for temperatures at late June. So we're doing great at setting these records. What's really happening here, though, is that these two things are happening together. And this is what's causing such a big problem for us when we start working in agriculture is how do I defend against this? I'm seeing higher temperatures and more variability. So as you can see, again, the old graph is the tall, skinny one. The new graph is the shorter, wider one. And here's the rub. We're seeing that the average temperature has increased. We're seeing that we should see more record hot weather, which we are. But we're also seeing that we're still going to preserve some of the cold temperatures that we have. And this is the thing that we get wrong so often, is it's not about everything getting warmer and we're not going to have winters anymore. We're still going to have record-setting cold temperatures. We're still going to see some of the winter stuff that we see. The variability is accounting for that. But we're seeing crazy droughts, crazy hot weather, overall temperature increases. And that's what it's all about. This is actually a really old figure. Almost 20 years now ago they made this figure, I believe, if I have the right one. This was the prediction. This is what we're seeing. Like, you can see now, oh yeah, we are still getting snow and stuff. Oh yeah, it is super hot in July. These are the sort of things that we can just pinpoint. I've got a few extra little pieces of data that link to this. This is, again, temperature change. In the background, there's a little gray one. That's the temperature distribution from 1951 to 1980. And the colorful one is from 2005 to 2015. Once again, you can see the distribution that happened is exactly what was predicted. It's shorter, it's wider. So we have seen exactly what we said. And we're living with it. So what kind of things do we have to deal with now? The more extreme weather events that we're seeing. Again, this is a terrible graph in a way. Don't get bogged down in all the colors and stuff like that. Like, it's pretty. All I really need right now is to look at the size of the overall bars. The overall bars add up all these extreme events that are happening. So if the overall bars have gotten taller, there's more and more extreme events. And you can see from 1970, where we were tracking a little under 100 events a year, now in the 2020s, we're tracking 400 plus events a year. So the intensity of these events has increased fourfold. So if I go and I talk, I mean, again, we've had some pretty down luck here on some of these extreme events. We've set records, several records for different events over the last 2 years. But if you go back and you talk to some of these climate change scientists, they're just going to say, that's what, yeah, we know. That's what we said was going to happen. And you know what? It's probably going to happen again. Records are made to be broken, right? So these are the types of things that we're going to see moving forward. The individual colors, if anyone's ever interested, you can find this on online, the same graph, but it's just showing the individual type of events. So you can see, for example, in blue is flooding, and we've seen flooding events jump from 50 to 200. That's global. Sometimes we have a tendency to think this is really not affecting us. And I know we've seen these events, but when I talk to some people, and it may not be you guys, but when I talk to some people, they'll say things like, well, this is just natural. Of course, you always have random chance that you're going to have one of these big events. We were due to have one eventually, although I would argue it seems kind of weird that we had them all the same year. But let's look at some local evidence. This is not my data. This is not my research or anything. This is from Environment Canada. I just went back and got all the data points from 1915 to whatever it is there. It ends up to 2020 or something, of average temperatures. And this is in Kentville. So for Kentville, Nova Scotia, the average temperature in 1915 was about 6 degrees. Now you can see, if we follow our nice little increase in line, that the average temperature in 2020 is a lot closer to 8.5 degrees. So once again, if we're not even looking at these events, if we're just looking at the data that's presented to us, we've seen pretty steady increase for 100 years of temperature, and we're sitting at almost 2.5 degrees warmer, and that's what we're living with. So we have lots of evidence, if we look around us, that these things are happening. Carbon dioxide's up. Again, we track that really well. Extreme events, more than 4-fold increase. Temperatures gone up in mean and variability. So there's my little spiel about climate change. I'm sure not everyone was tuning in today to talk about climate change for an hour. How is this going to affect the crops? This is really a tough question. I mean, I frame my whole research around this. So if I could just answer this today in the lecture, probably I don't have a job. But we can look at a few different things. With the things I just talked about, higher CO2, temperature changes, and extreme events, I pulled 3 of them out. And let's look at actually what's happening at the crop level. We're going to look at what's called CO2 fertilization, which is the effect of living with higher carbon dioxide. We're going to look at the increase in temperatures. And drought was the extreme event that I studied the most. So I picked a drought to talk about for now. But we can relate that to a lot of other extreme events. So with the carbon dioxide fertilization, this is actually, in a way, kind of good news. Real brief recap, make sure we're all on the same page here. We have pores on our leaves that are called stomata, and they facilitate all types of gas exchange, which means that for that little pore, that's how the plant takes in its carbon dioxide, runs it through all these little cycles that we're not going to worry about, but we know that it fixes the carbon dioxide to make sugars and other carbohydrates, and it breathes out oxygen and water vapor. So these are the very basics of our gas exchange. Now, if suddenly you make a big shift in one of these arrows and you suggest that there's going to be a whole bunch more CO2, remember, we've seen 33% increase in CO2 in the since 1970. Suddenly, we have more CO2 that's available for photosynthesis. This is a good thing because our photosynthesis is probably the main driver when we start looking at things like yields. If we have lots of photosynthesis, we have at least the potential for high yields. Having high CO2, that helps us with that. There's other things too. Because the CO2 is so prevalent now in the atmosphere, the stomata don't need to be as wide as they used to be. Means that as a plant, I can get just as much CO2 as I used to get, but close my stomata some. Since the stomata facilitates all gas exchange, it means that I could potentially lose less water. So as a plant, my efficiency has been increased. We see lots of examples of these. This is a meta-analysis plot. Again, I don't like to get people bogged down in all the nitty-gritty of it, but you need to have at least little context. There's a number down here at the bottom, which is 0, which gives us the typical response, or if nothing was happening. So there is our response if there was nothing happening. So if anything appears on this side of our graph, then we'll say that that's good. All right, that means that we see an increase in growth. There's my attempt to spell good with my mouse. So as you can see, in terms of things like yield, and this was an example with wheat, they took 95 different studies and summarized those and found, hey, there's actually roughly 25% increase in our grain yield because of higher CO2. And in this case here, they jumped up, I can't remember exactly, I think they jumped up to like 500 parts per million in this study. So it's a little higher than what we are now. Oh no, it says, sorry, on the right, yeah, 5 and 600. So you can see that there's the potential increase. This is just proof that we are increasing. I can do this all day long. I'm not going to, but we have studies all day long that take this. This breaks down grain yield and then says, well, okay, well, what happens if you grow it in tunnel? What happens if you grow it in free space? What if you grow it in an open top container? They're trying to say, like, does it help across the board, or is it only one type of growing environment that's affected? And the fact, again, that you see all of these points to the right-hand side is showing you that it works across the board. And they broke it down by country, and they broke it down by whether or not it's a spring or wheat or a winter variety. They tried all these things, and they always found higher CO2 improves yield. Now, the bad news. It's never all good news when we're talking about physiology stuff. There's always something called a biological trade-off. And if you think about this on the very basic level, you have to ask yourself a question. Why would a plant not behave this way all the time? Right? Like they adapted to do a certain thing. And if they wanted to grow more, why didn't they just adapt that way? Why didn't we say, oh, we want to have all these really high yields? But there's a cost associated with this. When you think about what carbon dioxide does, through photosynthesis, carbon dioxide is broken down into carbohydrates, which I'm representing as the carbon pool of the plant. It's got all this carbon it can use, and it can do anything it wants with it, like regular plant stuff. For our purposes, we'll say, if I've got some carbon, I could make it into carbohydrates, or I could take that same carbon and move it over and make amino acids. It's not so simple. I could also make lipids. I could make antioxidants. I can make all kinds of things. However, when my photosynthesis is increased, I start to see a shift. My plant tends to shift that carbon towards the carbohydrate side of things and away from some of these other things like amino acids. Because there's an increase in these non-structural carbohydrates, so that's sugars and things that might be in your plant, we start seeing a decrease in other things that are important, such as nutrients, such as proteins. So the downside of what we're dealing with here is that we're increasing the overall growth, we're increasing our carbon pool, but we're decreasing our overall nutrition. And this is something that's referred to as hidden hunger. The idea of hidden hunger is, I might be growing, if I grew, doesn't matter, I can choose anything. If I was growing an apple, and I'm growing it in a high CO2 environment, the apple could be the same size, maybe even bigger than some of the apples I grew before, but there's not as much nutrition. So as a consumer, if I'm eating this, I assume I'm getting the regular nutrition an apple provides me, but I'm actually getting much less. So I feel satiated, I feel full, but I'm not getting the nutrition that I need. This is a real problem. Once again, here's some data from a meta-analysis. In this case, the dashed line is over here on the right-hand side. That's our benchmark for no change. And everything to the left, in this case, is actually bad. So you can see again, we don't have to go through the individual types of crops, but the overall nutrition, they've used protein, iron, and zinc, which were the big three they started these sort of hidden hunger studies with. These have all decreased from anywhere from like 5-ish to 10%. So this is a real problem. They've extended this actually. They've started to look at all kinds of other stuff. Well, what about some of these other things? And you can see on this bar graph here, this breaks it down to the elemental level. Once again, things that are up here are good. So these are things that are higher. And you'll notice that there's not very many things living up in this side, just carbon. And well, we said that. That's the carbon pool. Every single other thing is decreasing to various degrees, and that's bad, and that's our hidden hunger. So one of the things that we're seeing physiologically is that we are producing less nutritious food as a result of our environment. There's some other good things that are happening, like, again, yield related things, because we have so much extra carbon. Plants are having, bigger roots and more leaves and more seeds, but we still suffer from that hidden hunger. So that's just one thing. That's the CO2 side of things. Now, a lot of people don't think about that with environmental stress. They start thinking about the things that we're seeing, because we don't see the higher CO2 here, but we do see higher temperatures. And I notice them. I notice them every summer these days. I find getting warmer and warmer. I always laugh at my own slides. I can't help laughing because I always seem to start with like super basic information that probably, you guys, a lot of you would have just told me. but I put it here anyway. I said all plants have an optimum temperature for growth. And you have this type of curve. So anytime you move off of that optimum, you get a little bit less growth. Right, great. Different plants have different temperatures they like, all that sort of thing. But in terms of our relevance, if I'm sitting here and I'm going to grow broccoli, I want to be right here, right? That's my highest growth rate. So this is where I want to live. With climate change, if we're seeing higher average temperatures, I'm actually moving over here in this direction. So now I'm living in a spot that's not nearly so good. I mean, that's the bare bones concern for temperature and what we're seeing. Now, of course, you could make an argument that we were here and we're actually moving in this direction. And that argument is also true. And don't worry too much about the specific species here, because there's tons of species. What this is saying is that probably we're opening up the opportunity for new things to grow that couldn't have grown here before. And this is the reason why that's so. But if I do move beyond that peak, I start to suffer from something called temperature stress. And high temperature stress or heat stress causes a lot of problems. From a plant standpoint, one of the main targets are our cellular membranes. Cellular membranes are composed of something called phospholipids, and they change in composition based on things like temperature. This is very much when we go the other way and we say, hey, how do some of these plants survive the winter? Same sort of idea. We're seeing a shift in some of our cellular membranes. The other thing to think about with cellular membranes, we have membranes around the outside of our cells, but we also have membranes around the organelles within our cells. Things like chloroplasts, which are facilitating our photosynthesis. So, again, one of the first targets that we're going to see is changes in our photosynthesis. On the flip side, in order for photosynthesis to occur, there are some enzymes that help it along. Enzymes are made out of proteins, which again are temperature dependent. So heat stress modifies the activity of our enzymes. One of the contributors to the fact that we have that little curve about optimum temperatures are these enzymes. They're designed to run at certain temperatures. The combination of these things result in more of a decrease in your photosynthesis. So we see overall decrease in our growth. Maybe we see senescence, which is just a fancy word for saying that there's death, either cellular death or whole plant death. There's also something else that happens. Any of these stresses that happen, like temperature, create what are called reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are generally free radicals. There's some exceptions, but they're extremely greedy little molecules. Reactive oxygen species, because they're greedy, they're trying to grab electrons from other molecules. And when they do that, they disrupt what that molecule can do. If I relate this to a human level, when we go out in the sun and you get a sunburn, you've taken some damage. And that stress creates reactive oxygen species within our bodies. Those reactive oxygen species start to cause all kinds of different harm. And when people start worrying about things like skin cancer, one of the risks is we've got this greedy little molecule that wants electrons. It grabs it from something, some of our DNA, disrupts that, and suddenly we've got a cancer cell or something like that. It's the exact same thing in the plant. So these cause additional damage. It's hard to say what they damage, depends what they touch. But it causes damage and can also cause death. It's really easy to look and see some of the data here. I pulled some of these data just from papers. They're not Nova Scotian, but it applies across the board when we start looking at crops. So this is the Barbados nut. They had heat of up to 43 degrees Celsius, and immediately we see a decrease 41% in our photosynthesis. Honestly, I wouldn't worry too much about the other. Technically, they measure those other things, but we're going to kick on that photosynthesis because that's going to translate to a decrease in our yields. If we look at something else, this is grapes. Temperatures hit 45 degrees Celsius, 60% decrease in our photosynthesis. So, I mean, these are pretty warm temperatures, but even small temperature changes away from your optimum affect that photosynthesis. And that's something we can measure. I routinely measure it in my research to look at what's happening to these things. Our plant's not helpless, though. Our plant can deal with these. I mean, that's why it doesn't die as soon as it gets too hot. One of the things they can do is they alter the membrane composition. So they change their composition to lipids that can handle those temperatures a little bit better. The other thing that they do is they accumulate things like antioxidants or other osmolytes. And by accumulating those, they offer some level of protection. They also allow the plant to keep going with its water uptake. Now, while we're talking about water uptake, the last one of these stresses is drought. This is one of our extreme conditions. Drought is a tricky one because there's not really a set number that says, oh, darn, we have a drought now. So the better term is often water deficit. So drought or water deficit occurs anytime when there's really just not enough soil in the water to maintain that physiological function, right? There's changes in water potential and stuff that cause that. If I look at my plant, when there's lots of water, everything works really, really well. My plant has nice open stomata so that it can facilitate that gas exchange that we talked about earlier on. Normally, if the stomata are open, photosynthesis remains pretty high because I can do what I need to do. I can take in my carbon dioxide. I've got lots of water moving. I'm a happy little plant. In times of limited water, plants produce a compound. Well, they produce plenty of compounds, but the classic one is abscisic acid. And one of the roles of abscisic acid is to close the stomata. This is a protective measure by the plant. The whole idea, if I'm a plant and I start not having enough water, is I'm going to tell my leaves, hey, we better shut down production here for a little bit. I don't have enough water to do my job. I'm going to shut down here. We're going to conserve the water that we have. The side effect is those gates are two-way channels. If I shut down for water, I cannot have it continue with the other gas exchange. So that means I also shut down my carbon dioxide movement. As a result, I also have to shut down my photosynthesis. One of the things when I'm teaching my ecophysiology class that I talk to students about is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a really early indicator that there's something wrong. I know what the photosynthesis should be if I have a healthy plant of all kinds of different varieties or species. And if the number is not that, it's just like us going to the doctor and taking our temperature. And we see that we've got a little fever. We know, okay, we might be fighting through something or we might be getting sick. When the plant sees a decrease in photosynthesis like that, I know something is up. With the drought, we can't cool down if I'm a plant. Stomata also are releasing heat. They work a little bit like us sweating. So we have temperature stress, and therefore we get a lot of the same problems that we just talked about: membrane damage, reactive oxygen species, maybe senescence. And because I can't bring in carbon anymore, anything I was building, like chlorophyll, can't be built. So you can kind of see how things start to compound themselves. And it sort of sucks if you're a plant, because this was your best bet. This was your protective mechanism. If I'm doing this, it means I'm already in trouble, right? So as a plant, we're looking for ways to not get to this point. Anything else I could do as a plant is a better strategy, like accumulating the sugars I talked about before. Just to throw some data in with this, this is soil water content over here on the left-hand side. So if I look here, again, numbers don't matter, but as I go down the table, I see decreasing soil water content. If I look at the photosynthesis, look at the exact same thing. So even a small decrease in soil water content is enough to trigger the plant to shut down production a little bit. It senses small changes like that. In this case here, we had a 26% decrease when we moved down to soil water content of 30 to 25%. There's lots of different graphs that I can show the exact same thing. In this case, this is the relative yield as a percentage of the control, which means that this line here that I'm drawing in is our good line. The drought stress is shown here in pink. So you can see that the plots have moved down below that line, which are just showing again that as soon as we experience some of our drought stress, we're seeing reductions in our photosynthesis, which is translating to reductions in our yield. In this case, they separated it based on plants that use C3 versus C4 photosynthesis, but still 40% decrease, 50% decrease. So again, from a production standpoint, this is a big problem. How do plants adapt to this? The easiest way that they can adapt to this is to accumulate certain osmolytes. This is something else we can measure in the plant. Just like we could measure how much ABA was being translocated from one point to another. But if we can look at the osmolytes, what the osmolytes do is allow it to continue to grab water even when water is limited, which is a better strategy for the plant because it means I can leave my stomata open and still facilitate my photosynthesis. Again, I can't stress enough that if a plant has decided to shut down photosynthesis for any reason, this is going to give a big problem to us. All right. So now we've seen those three individual things. Let's look at the overall impacts of climate change. Then we'll look at some quick case studies and then we'll be done. Climate change. We mentioned three major challenges here. I said, hey, from a yield perspective, actually, with the higher CO2, that's not so bad. But temperature and drought and other stresses is not so good. So the problem with assessing climate change is that we have multiple things that are changing at one time. So I can't just look at one of them and say this is all good or this is all bad. There's a nice study here that was released in 2017 that tried to quantify the changes in many of these crops. What we're actually looking at in these graphs, it's really tempting to look at the bars down at the bottom, but honestly, that's not relevant at all. The bars show us how many studies they base the data on. That's the thing with your meta-analysis. They go and grab a whole bunch of studies. So in many cases, they had dozens of studies. The idea being that every scientist kind of found slightly different results. If I look at this 40 different scientists, I should get some sort of consensus. What I'm really interested in is the solid line. So the solid green line right here represents the expected yield loss in maize for every degree Celsius that we increase. The biggest thing to take home about it is that it goes down. This suggests that overall, and although it's mapping it by temperature, it's taking in the whole effect of climate change, all these interacting factors. I see the same thing here for rice. A decrease, I'm decreasing by negative or by 20% or so. If I only go lower, like 1.5 degrees Celsius, I'm still at 10% decreases. So again, it doesn't take a big shift to cause a problem. I likely don't have to even tell you guys. I know that a lot of people that are attending this today are producers. If I tell you you're going to take a 10% hit on your yield, I assume you're already kind of cranky. If I look here, I've got some other species just to look. Wheat at the same 1.5 degree decrease, it's a 8% loss of yield. Soy is 15% loss in yield. So the conclusion that we've come to, and you can go to any number of studies, climate change is going to cause a lot of environmental stresses, and we are going to see decreased yields if we don't do something. This is where I come in for my side of things. My research in ecophysiology is not just about what's happening, but I spend a lot of time trying to come up with new technologies to help this. So one of the examples that I did a study recently on broccoli, and one of the technologies that I used, I've got the seedling growth improved by 50%. And I can do that even under drought. So these are the types of things that we do, and not just me. I'm giving myself a plug, but people at our university, Faculty of Agriculture, people at other agricultural institutions are working on this to try and say, is there a way that we can mitigate this? Because we know it's coming. As I mentioned at the start, Nova Scotia's already gone up 2.5 degrees in 100 years. So it's not like we are getting caught with our pants down anymore. We know things are happening. And with that, we'll look at some things happening in 3 different examples. Now, guys, I have no idea what you all produce or work in, what fields you work in. So I had to grab some things from the fields that I've done research in. And one of the things I work in is with Christmas trees. So early on, one of the things that we were approached for was that balsam fir trees weren't having great needle retention after they were cut down. They need cold acclimation for this to do. And actually, I just published a paper in 2023 that looked at this yet again, this idea of cold acclimation. But without it, 1 in 3 trees aren't surviving the export process in terms of needle loss. The problem, if you can look at this graph here, I tried to label it so it's a little bit easier. The middle graph shows trees that were harvested in April. And the reason that that's chosen, because I'm fully aware that we don't traditionally cut down Christmas trees in April. The reason this was chosen is it gives you a benchmark that's in between certain seasons. So you've got something that's a little bit milder in the spring so that we can look at what's happening in the summer and then what happens again in the late fall. So if I look at the curves here, you'll see that in the summer, it shifts to the left. This is a bad thing. It shows that the needles are lost earlier if you start cutting at that time. But if you cut in the autumn, it shifts to the right. This was something that was supporting that the cold acclimation is essential. This is one area that's concerned with the Christmas trees. There's other areas as well, but like I say, this on its own is a problem because again, with climate change, we're not seeing our autumns get quite as cold. So if I'm a Christmas tree producer, I have to at least be a little concerned. Is like, what happens if it starts getting a little warmer every fall and my trees, my product is a little bit less desirable each year? So that's one problem. Another case study, another industry that I worked with was maple. So maple is a curious one because it's very dependent on the weather. You need a very specific type of climate to collect maple sap. What you're really looking for is that time of year where your daytime temperatures go above 0, but your nighttime temperatures still go below 0. And that gives you your best sap flow. If I look at this graph, or this map, the dark green areas have the highest sap flow, and places that are shaded not so green have much lower sap flow. You'll notice that in this particular case, a lot of that's the northern United States. And that makes sense because right now, some of the best production that you can get is found in Wisconsin, Michigan, Vermont, New Hampshire. But in the future, because of some of the expected changes in our climate, we're gradually seeing that band of good production shift northward. So I guess in some ways, good news for Canada, because in the future, that whole band is almost Canadian, which would suggest that we would have the highest sap flow, which we currently don't. There's other things too, though. There's changes in the sugar content that are happening. We're seeing changes in the soil moisture. A lot of it has to do with many of our winters that have reduced snow cover. I'm kind of just acting on a hunch that soil moisture may not be as big an issue this spring, but that's what happens when you get a meter of snow. And we're seeing differences in mortality of the trees. So you're seeing tree dieback. So, I mean, there's lots of problems threatening this industry. And for the last one, I went back beyond the last couple of years. In 2019, we had a wicked frost that came. I forget the exact date. I think it was June 6th, but it came in June. We weren't really expecting frost at that point, and there was a major problem or impact on our berry industry. And I've got it listed here that we wiped out 70% of the blueberry crop that year. And I focused in on that because it came up in the news article, and that was all in the media. But as I recall, strawberries, grapes, other fruit were affected as well by this late frost. These late frosts, they're the reality as things change, because we're seeing that increase in variability that we talked about. We're going to see weird frosts that crop up at times that we don't see. From the physiological standpoint, one of the big concerns is that our reproductive structures, such as flowers or fruit, are the most vulnerable. And they're the most vulnerable because the tissues are much softer in those areas. So therefore, they're much easier to rupture than, say, something very firm or woody. But also, again, if I'm thinking about the plant, and I'm a plant and I'm interested in reproduction, I've focused all of my carbon into the reproductive structure, because that was my job. That was my biological role. I did not focus a whole bunch of my carbon into protection against things like stress. So if I have this fruit, it's a goner. There is a formation of intracellular crystals, ice crystals. If the plant is not prepared to deal with that, there's changes in the membranes again. The membranes will rupture, especially when it thaws out. So when it thaws out, those crystals are more mobile and they start to slice the membranes. So you get membrane leakage. The enzymes aren't going to work at those temperatures. We get a big production of those reactive oxygen species I talked about before. Of course, we don't see any of that. We just see that our plants look wilted and damaged. If they had flowers, they're in trouble. If they have foliage, they don't look great. And if they had buds, they might not anymore. So that's what we end up seeing. So those are three examples that we've seen. Those are three local examples that we're seeing and we're living with. That really brings me full circle on what I wanted to talk about today. So in summary, this is the things that we looked at. We saw the three changes with climate change, the CO2 temperatures, and extreme events, and we talked about some of the consequences of those. We looked overall that because of this, climate change is probably going to have an adverse effect on yields. And then we looked at three case studies, in this case, balsam fir Christmas trees, maple trees, and blueberries. So that's it for me. I'll leave it at that. And I'm new to this, so I don't really know what happens next. So I guess I'm probably turning it over to Caitlin for a minute.
Yeah, we do have a question that came in, so we'll take a look at that. Can you speak on drought conditions and spraying contact herbicides? So while in a drought, this person was told not to bother spraying in dryland sections because of some of the perennial weeds like kochia had developed a waxy cuticle to protect themselves. And is that because of increased ABA production?
Okay, it's an interesting question. So I'm going to, and there's a lot to it.
Yes.
What I'm going to try to focus on is that comment about the development of waxy cuticles.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime that there's a foliar spray, we're concerned about the waxy cuticles because it inhibits the ability of any of our sprays to make it into the foliage. And if it can't make it in, it can't do its job. Mm-hmm. So in this case, I would guess that you were advised not to do that because you're just wasting your money. The spray is probably not going to have the effect you were hoping. If it has any effect, it's going to be greatly reduced. That's not directly related to ABA on its own, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. But the development of a waxy cuticle can be related to the drought stress. It's just a different signal than ABA. The waxy cuticle does the same thing. If it's stopping things from getting in, it's also stopping things from getting out. So it helps to conserve water in the plant. So not linked to ABA, but that's the problem if you've developed waxy cuticles because of drought protection, that your sprays will be less effective.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I have a question as well.
Okay.
So thinking about early in the 2023 season when we did see fairly high temperatures and drought stress,
Mhm.
um, you said when the plants are under drought stress and they're kind of closing up their stomata, they're kind of trying to protect themselves. So does that have an impact on their ability to take up nutrients? Like if they're trying to kind of protect themselves, are they as able to take up nutrients like from the
Oh,
soil?
yeah, that's a great question, actually. And so the short answer of that is absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So with your stomata, we already talked about the fact that there's gas exchange, and one of the things that does is it also exposes you to the environment, like the
Mhm.
atmosphere. This transpiration is the biggest driver we have for water movement in a plant. The equivalent of it would be, think about sucking on a straw.
Mhm.
If I just put a straw in water, you might actually see some water move up the straw a little bit because of adhesion to the sides of the straw. And you can try this at home easy enough, but it
Mhm.
won't overflow your straw. But if you suck on it, you can get the liquid up. Transpiration, that's what it's doing. So it's pulling everything up through it. Since the nutrients are water soluble, the plant is dependent on water movement to move nutrition in through it.
Mhm.
Without that, there can be all the nutrients in the world in that soil, and it won't do a lick of good for your plant.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting because we think about it from the soil perspective. Like, if the soil is dry, then some of the nutrients aren't as mobile and but then it's kind of a double whammy because then our plant isn't as able to take it up either. So yeah,
And you
big
can see
issue.
and that's why I show the data. Like, not everyone likes to see numbers and stuff, but when you can see that even that small shift, like we saw like 15% decrease in soil moisture, which is
Yeah,
not especially dry,
right,
right? Like if you drop down to 60% soil moisture content, you're not arid,
right.
but the photosynthesis is already decreased,
Mm,
which from a nutrient standpoint means that there's less water flowing through my plant now.
right.
Yeah.
No, awesome.